Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. In the news recently, we've seen a lot of tension between the IDF and Egypt, particularly since the fall of Mubarak and the rise of a certain element that seeks to pit the Egyptian people at odds with the state of Israel for somewhat radical purposes, but I think more appropriately we could say rhetorical purposes. Now, why rhetorical? Because when we speak of rhetoric, or we speak of something being a rhetorical question, we speak of it not having an intended answer. So if you say, what are you, stupid? You say that for polemic purposes. You say it to denigrate your opponent, the person that you're framing as your opponent. The rhetorical question is a question composed of rhetoric. So for rhetorical purposes, the people of Egypt are being pitted against by a certain element against the state of Israel. And now we noticed when these uprisings in the so-called Arab Spring were happening, there was nary a mention of Israel or Zionism or the Jews or anything like that. The Jews, also known as the Jews or Yahud, or any other extremely elongated voweled reference that we're used to hearing in Western protests about anything political whatsoever going on in the Middle East. So, particularly in the United Kingdom, in London, Israel and the Jews and Yahud and so on and so forth figure in a central place within the rhetoric at these protests. That wasn't really the case in the so-called Arab Spring, but now that Mubarak's out of the way, there is a certain element, some would argue that they're the so-called Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and that they're trying to hijack the movement in the same way that the Khomeinyists did with the youth movement against the Shah and his repressive regime, which ended up being followed by an even more repressive and oppressive regime. Now, when I say rhetorical, I mean that, again, that there is no answer. One example that I'd like to give is of the seizure of my Range Rover recently by the police. Now, I wonder if you'll bear with me if I could find a picture of something similar. Let's see what we can find. Let's see if anything pops up. This was a really great Range Rover. Let me see if anything. Oh yeah, that looks just like it right there. Mine was a 1990, however, not a 1987. So pretty old. Actually, it was in the World Trade Center debris. They had to give it a once over and inspected all of those cars, and then put a tag on the back of it with the Twin Towers and an American flag and everything that it still had. So anyway, I got a Rover that looked just like that for about $3,000. Put in a new exhaust system a few years ago, and haven't driven it much. Now, the police came and confiscated this vehicle. The vehicle was completely paid for, but they confiscated it against my will. I saw them doing it. I went out and I talked to them and I said, from a decent human being, one decent human being to another decent human being, could you just let me move it to the back? It was moved in front of my house, or it was in front of the house. We weren't driving it. And the complaint was that it has to be moved every 24 hours. And even though this was on a Sunday morning, right after Shabbat, and even though I could have asserted a religious exercise issue there, I just simply hadn't driven it for even longer than that. So I told them, I'm not going to lie to you, I haven't driven it, and they took it. I asked, can we move it to the back? They said no. So I said, well, I've fallen on hard financial times. I'm a graduate student. I've got a baby on the way, and I don't have the money to pay to get that out of impounding. If you could just let me move it. And they refused. It was completely unreasonable. I think anybody, even most cops, would see their actions and attitudes as unreasonable. But they did it anyway. Now, one thing they didn't get was the key. Now, let me ask you, if I wore this key around my neck for the next, let's say, 70 years, and over the course of that time, every time I met anyone who was related to a police officer, I brought this story up. And I said, this is what happened. I was deprived of my lovely Range Rover, and I want it back. And let's say I went even further. And for even 70 years from now, let's say I was still alive, let's say even my kids carried this mission on, to get the Range Rover back. Let's say even that the police took this Range Rover and they renovated it, and they put a lot of money into this Range Rover. Let's say they had Exhibit come, they had an MTV show, and Exhibit came and pimped the ride, okay? He tricked it out better than it's ever been, because as you can see, that's about what it looked like. It's not, awful, but it's more of a utility vehicle. It's made for off-roading. It wasn't a luxury vehicle by the time I got my hands on it, at least, I guess I got it in 2007, so, it was 17 years old. It had renovations done to keep it up. It had a new engine block put in at about 100,000 miles, and so it was still running. It was good. It was serving its purpose, but we hadn't pimped it. We hadn't put all this money into it because we didn't have money. So let's say that the police, they really tricked it out, and they were driving it around, and they made it in such a way that it was still not worn out 70 years from now. Let's say my kids and my grandkids were so incensed by this that they attacked not just police stations, but the families of police, even police departments and the families of police at departments who had nothing to do with the theft of my Range Rover. Let's say they blew up school buses that the children of these police officers, or of police officers, not even the guilty culprits who stole this, but of anyone's, people who were children of police who became police officers after the stealing of my Range Rover. And let's say all the while, I sat at home and watched my satellite TV of, police brutality and stuff like that, stuff that goes on, awful stuff, and wore this around my neck, or my kids did, or whatever, or they just kept it. And would that sound reasonable, or would that sound like rhetoric? Would that sound, and again, what I mean by rhetoric is something that doesn't have an answer. Would that be something, would they ever get the Range Rover back, or would this result in the SWAT team coming to their house? Would this result in them dying? Would this result in them going to prison for the rest of their lives? Would it improve their situation, Or would it just make them feel good about themselves, like they were doing something for their family honor? But at the same time, would it be moving them forward, or would it be not even just keeping them at a standstill, but moving them backwards? That's a question for you to answer for yourselves. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum.